Eric. Uh, so I'm Kyle Thompson. Happy to be here. Happy to be with all y'all. I hope you're having a good day. Uh, I'm here to talk a little bit about the podcast, General Intellect Unit. So I'm going to share my screen from a Miro board, and if we have time, we'll maybe go there together and do some workshopping later in the session. But let's just see how it goes. So first, I'll share this. All right. Uh, so yeah, you can see the logo of the podcast there that June put together. Um, General Intellect Unit was a podcast of the cybernetic marxists, as we called ourselves. Uh, and it ran from late 2017 until the spring of last year. And essentially, I'm going to talk today about what I get out of reflecting on the podcasting experience and how that could be relevant for democratic economic planning efforts in the future. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this or that story about what happened, but I'm just going to use those examples, those anecdotes to give some highlights, some information and examples of this little bit of a model that I've come up with to try to explain what we were doing and how that made a contribution. So you can see here, this is a nice little thing that June put together from Stafford Beer's writing. Hello, I would like to talk to you if you have the time in a new sort of way about a new sort of world. And Stafford Beer was, of course, a huge inspiration for the podcast. We didn't exactly start there, but I will kind of show you how it figured in the whole thing. So, yeah, I have this little bit of a model that I've made here, and we'll start over here on the left. And so, if you think about this as the process of making the podcast and what it brought together, the initiating subjects, that would be me and also June. In fact, June was the person who started the whole thing going. We kind of had these important factors that helped us to get involved and start something. Uh, and so what I said here is that, for us, we had a context of life experience, a context of urgency and inspiration, a context of the medium familiarity with podcasting and the aesthetics of podcasting. And we had our personality factors, and they came together to create a focus of attention and interest. So if I talk about the context of life experience, for myself, what really mattered was, I started out in politics as a social democrat growing up in Canada. But really, the important thing for me was working in Japan during the 2008 financial crisis. I was working in the Nagoya area, and that's where most of the Toyota manufacturing happens in Japan. And so there were not just the Toyota factories, but all of the suppliers for Toyota that were in the surrounding area where I was living. And, business just shut down because finance shut down. And the shock to people's livelihood, the organization of the government tax base, even things like us going through the winter without heating in the office because we couldn't, like, the government couldn't afford to pay it. That kind of stuff was happening. It was total chaos at my workplace. Uh, whether there would still be, like, the university or the small university I was working at, whether that would still continue to exist was a really big open question, and there were lots of political battles going on to try to get the place to survive. There were people coming from the head offices of the prefectural government. I saw tons of stores shut down around me. I saw all kinds of Nikkei Japanese, or people who had moved, who had Japanese ancestry and had moved to the area uh, because they had Japanese ancestry from Brazil and Peru and so on. Uh, they were just like deported back to these countries, even though they had lived in the area for a long time. They had put down roots. Their shops were shuttered. There were like bank robberies happening in my area, and this was something that was just like unheard of in Japan. And it was real chaos around me, and that was a context of life experience that was important to me. I went to grad school shortly after this, and I ran into a bunch of Marxist professors, and they helped me to get kind of an orientation and see, like, yeah, this is a way to look at the world and make sense of the chaos around me. I met Andrew Feenberg. He was my advisor, and he kind of put me on this track of thinking about utopia, planning, cybernetics, all this kind of stuff, along with Rick Bruneau. They were both professors at Simon Fraser University. So that was a life experience context for me. The context of urgency and inspiration. So for me, at the time of starting the podcast, I was a doctoral student at Kyoto University. And the urgency and inspiration for me was like, I was doing all of this doctoral reading. Like, there's a really great economics library at Kyoto University that has tons and tons and tons of Marxist economic texts in it, because up until, the end of the Cold War, they basically ran a dual program of doing like bourgeois economics and Marxist economics, and you'd have people in both tracks because they were one of those countries that was kind of on the border between the socialist world and the capitalist world. And so they had this huge, extensive library of just great texts. And I was reading all this stuff. I was internalizing all this stuff. I attended a talk at Kyoto University by Andrew Pickering, who was somebody who really inspired GIU. I read his book, and I talked to him a little bit about, Stafford Beer and cybernetics and economic planning, Cybersyn, all that kind of stuff. So that was a context of inspiration. And urgency was just like, I felt like I was cooped up in the ivory tower. I wasn't getting anything I was learning out there in the world. And I wanted to get it out to people. I wanted to have a broader conversation. I wanted to make this learning somehow meaningful to people's lives in a way that wasn't just about publishing academic papers or whatever. The context of medium familiarity and aesthetics. So this is about podcasting, right? And for June and myself, we both met in the duckfeed.tv Slack, which is a podcasting network that does like culture stuff, like video games and movies and that kind of thing. They do long form content. And we both listened to a lot of their stuff that Gary Butterfield and Cole Ross and the other people on there did. And essentially listening to those podcasts and the long form discussions they were having about, Dark Souls or whatever, it gave us an understanding of how to podcast. And a lot of people in that community, the Slack that they had and all that, or still have, they went on to start podcasts themselves, but we were maybe the only ones who went to start a political podcast. It didn't really matter, though, because we still learned a lot about podcasting just from being listeners and being a part of that aesthetic milieu. And then June, she had like audio engineer training. So that helped as well a lot with creating the aesthetic of the podcast. And then this last factor here that I want to point to is personality. And this was important for us because it set the way that we interacted with each other. It set the kind of like editorial direction of the podcast, what our selection of topics would be, how we managed our community, all those kinds of things. It was important that we had this kind of personal relationship where we both had this kind of common understanding that, the way June put it when I talked to her the other day was it was sort of like trying to create something similar to the kind of like black metal music that she admired, where it was just like you just make the thing that you want to make and you put it out there, and if somebody likes it, that's great, and if they don't, too bad. You like it or you don't. And that was kind of the approach we took to choosing topics, um, putting ourselves out there in the world, and running our community, taking feedback from the community, all that kind of stuff based on our personalities and what our interest was, where it was just like, we have these interests, we want to explore them. And if other people come and are interested in what we're doing, that's awesome. But we're not driven by a desire to please others or to be popular. Um, so the personality, the personal interest was what drove it, or our own curiosity drove it. So I think that was important for how it came together. And all of these things together, they come to form a kind of focus of attention and interest. June kind of described for like us what our general focus was for the podcast. She said there were like sort of 4 points that mattered to her. The first one was to take Marx's analysis and run with it and expand on it for today. So look at the landscape out there as it actually is and understand that like the capitalist adversary is both capable and dynamic, and running with it, expanding it is essential to be viable in this environment. Another thing she said is that like it was an important investigation about how to organize ourselves. How do you fight fire with fire? How do you outmaneuver the opponent? How do you sustain yourself? I think that was a really important question of like, okay, if you get something going, how do you make it sustainable? How do you make it viable? This is where like the viable system model stuff was so meaningful to us. Another thing was, yeah, on that point, how do you sustain something past revolution systematically? How do you stick the landing? How do you make it durable? And the final point was trying to imagine something that we could have faith in on the left. June had been through an anarchist milieu. I had been through social democratic stuff. We had both like sort of been around Occupy, and we had skepticism. We have a lot of skepticism. We brought a lot of skepticism coming from our personalities and our experiences to the podcast. But we also had a desire to have some faith in a left project, in a socialist project. And if what we see out there doesn't make sense, how do we fix it? That generated a lot of curiosity for us. So all of those things together form this kind of focus of attention and interest. So that would move us on from this arrow, your focus of attention and interest. It kind of comes together and it forms a sort of intentional vector, is what I would argue. It's like a line of intention in the world that you are making, you're putting out there. And this intentional vector in creating the podcast, making it happen, it creates a kind of gravitation of interest and attention. So we have attention and interest, and we turn that into an intentional vector that has its own gravitation, and it draws other people into this vector. And they contribute different things to it, right? They contribute, their expertise. Maybe they're a guest on the show. They contribute their interest. Maybe they're a listener. They contribute their feedback, maybe as a community member or a mentor or something like that. Material contributions. We had a Patreon community that, or a Patreon that helped keep the podcast going. But we also had people contribute like show topic suggestions to us. And we had community development. You know, people contribute their own time, their energy to not necessarily administering the community, but they contribute their own perspectives, their ideas, you know, emotional support, solidarity, all of this kind of stuff. They contribute to each other in the community, and it helps to make this vector stronger. So then this, when you reach this kind of event horizon here, I would say, where the intentional vector goes from something intensive to becoming something expansive. And you see unfolding possibilities of the intentional vector happening out of there. So this creates things like planning, futuring. You know, it's planning is a type of futuring, and what I mean by that is doing work to imagine futures, to plan for futures, to create scenarios, and collaborating around these things. It creates production of the podcast, production of reading groups, production of other people's like writings or subsequent podcasts, and so on. It creates imagination, the imagination of, you know, maybe just what's next on the podcast, but also just moment to moment while podcasting. Like, what's the next thing you're going to think about? What are your ideas that are coming together in doing it? What is the audience and the community members thinking when they are listening to your podcast or talking about it? Manifestation, you know, is making a community, making a podcast, making a thing out there. Structuring, I think it helps to structure people's days to listen to your podcast, their weeks, or it structures their time, is what I'm trying to say. It structures your own time, your own research, your own interests, and it creates a kind of, you know, framework extending into the future. Development is, you know, self-development of the project from that intentional vector into something larger. And subjectification, I would say, is something that happens both for the podcasters, the original subjects involved, but also for the listeners in terms of saying, like, well, okay, how does this make me a political subject? How do I think about the world from what I am listening to? What is my stance relative to it? How much do I identify with it? All of that kind of thing. How does it interact with my personality? I think that these kinds of things unfold from that intentional vector, and then they go on to sort of expand and keep going forward. There's the important point I would make about this is, like, it has its own kind of gravity, and it also is, you know, so it is kind of intensive. It draws things to it, but it also is expansive because, you know, maybe like with Duckfeed TV, people listen to your podcasts and then they go and start their own podcasts, and then that's in a whole other direction that it goes in that has a family resemblance to where it came from. And I think that General Intellect Unit, you know, is an example of all of these things happening. You know, it's like whether it's the guests we got on the show, the reading groups that started from it, people's research papers that came out of it, people's activism in like at the local level and trying to apply like the ideas that we drew into the podcast to like local organizing or local political efforts. I think all of these kinds of like intentional vectors came out there. And I guess the point I just want to make about that is like, that is something that originates from those like, you know, initiating subjects. But once you get it going, you're involved here, you're involved in this process, you're involved in all of this stuff, but it's also kind of a thing that gets out there in the world and it can draw people to it in itself. And so, you know, we ended the podcast because June was too busy with work. But even so, we both were talking the other day and we still felt like we really appreciate the podcast. And, if June didn't have these other priorities that were, in her personal life at this moment more pressing, like, parenting and work and so on, uh, we would want to continue to do it. And the reason for that is because that vector is still drawing us to it. It's still out there in the world, and it's still creating things, and it's being carried forward by other people. So I think in terms of democratic economic planning, the thing to think about here is, okay, like, what are the contexts for you that cause you to be interested in democratic economic planning? Like, for you personally. And how does your personality interact with that? And then how do all of these things form a focus of attention and interest that will allow you to initiate some kind of intentional vector or join in on someone else's? Because that's where I think, like, you can think about the planning process as something that is, an umbrella or a top down or an org chart or something like that. But there's also a way where it's kind of just like this unfolding from people's intention through time that draws people into it, gravitationally speaking. And that's just a different model of thinking about how planning happens that I think that, I sort of brought from reflection on doing the podcast myself. Um, and yeah, what podcasting can contribute to democratic economic planning. Because we talked about this, June and I, and it's like podcasting isn't really a viable substitute for news media. It's something that can exist alongside news media, but it doesn't perform the same functions because it doesn't have the same kind of institutional basis that news media needs. However, it can generate interest, it can transmit ideas, and it can move intention. And so I think that is just one perspective on this kind of organizing planning question that I think can come out of podcasting. So yeah, how are we doing for time? How is this going?
We're at 24 minutes.
Okay, cool, great, awesome. So, well, now Eric, you had the Zoom link or the Miro link, right?
Yes, let me get it. Also, if we're now going to the workshop part, I would end the recording here.
Yeah.
Just
So
okay.
for people who listen to this, I hope this is inspiring. I will just say that I will explain what the workshop part exercise is going to be to sort of show where I was going with this, so the people who are listening to this could, reflect on that, even though they're not going to see the specifics of what we do here.
Got it. Just let me
Yeah,
know
go ahead.
when you're done, and yeah, when I can
Sure.
end.
Okay. Well, yeah. So basically, all I've done here is very simple. I've laid out post-it notes for context, people's context, their personal context, their focus, what kind of focus they see in their personal context of intention and attention they have, uh, and what kind of intention that could lead to, what kind of intentional vector it could lead to. Something creative they could do or join in on that would contribute in some way to democratic economic planning, the activism around that, the knowledge and the connections around that, all that kind of thing. So if you think for yourself, well, based on the example I've given, what the relevant context might be for you, what kind of focus you have, and where your intention is going, that might be a good way to understand your contribution and what you could put forward in the future. So that is generally the idea I had. Thanks for listening. And yeah, I'm sure I'll be around and doing things. Please check out Night at the Barricades. I think that it will be out very shortly. So I'll be promoting that around. It is an interesting game about sustainability activism and anti-capitalist activism in a way that relies a lot on the understanding of personality and how different personalities interact with each other. So I think it's also relevant to what I'm sort of talking about here. So yeah, check that out when it's available. Give it a go. Play it with your friends or fellow activists or coworkers, and I I hope that this is all very fruitful for you. That's
Okay,
the end of my talk.
okay, thanks a lot. I'm gonna stop the recording now.